When we think about ocean wildlife, our minds might go to fish, whales, sharks, generally animals that live underneath the water. But some of the most important biodiversity lives above the ocean's surface. I'm Connel Bradwell, a wildlife conservationist here in British Columbia.
And I'm Erica Porter, a fisher here in Nova Scotia.
We are the hosts for Coastlines, a CBC series that brings together young Canadians who are working to save our animals, plants and habitats on all three of Canada's coasts.
And today we're talking about seabirds. Seabirds are both marine and terrestrial animals, meaning they rely on both the land and the sea for their survival. Now, they spend most of their lives out at sea, but will return to land to breed, often in huge colonies.
Many of these birds embark on epic journeys out at sea, crossing multiple countries and thousands of kilometers.
Just one bird's life, it's going farther than any of us will probably go in our lifetime, so that's just really impressive for such a small bird.
Joanna Wong and her team recently helped to map the Canadian Arctic tern migration for the first time.
Arctic terns are the world's longest migrating animal, and they're about just the size of an apple. They're relatively small, but they travel huge distances. In fact, every year they migrate from the Canadian Arctic all the way down to the Antarctic, covering up to about 90,000 kilometers round trip.
You heard that right. The Arctic terns will migrate from pole to pole in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. But for a long time, exactly what route these terns were taking on their long polar journey was a mystery.
So scientists on Joanna's team traveled to the Arctic tern's breeding sites, attaching these tiny computers onto the bird's ankle using a small ring.
We have this little computer, as you can see here. It's very minuscule. And the reason it's so tiny is because I mentioned these Arctic terns are very small birds. So you need a device that's small enough that it doesn't drag them down in their flight.
As part of Joanna's research, she analyzed all of the data collected by these computers and mapped out routes that the Arctic terns take from the Canadian Arctic to the Antarctic and back. They found that all the Arctic terns, whether they breed in Canada, Europe, or elsewhere, are taking the same migrating route to the Antarctic, likely because of food availability and using the wind currents to their advantage.
Knowing where Arctic terns are migrating and at what times can help us to protect them along particularly important segments of their long migration. The more science we gather about Arctic terns, the better equipped decision makers will be to strategically protect the lands and the waters that are important to marine birds.
One of these important places is Newfoundland, the seabird capital of North America, which is home to a globally significant number of wintering and breeding seabirds, like the ever-charismatic Atlantic puffin. Karen Richards, a researcher out of Memorial University, has spent her fair share of time with these very cute birds.
My PhD is investigating the impact of extreme weather events on two threatened seabirds, the Atlantic puffin and the Leach's storm petrel. Both of these species nest in burrows on islands during the breeding season.
Now, Newfoundland isn't necessarily known for its balmy weather, and with climate change bringing more extreme temperatures and storms to the island, the chicks are left particularly vulnerable to extreme conditions. Karen's trying to better understand how to save these threatened chicks.
We placed temperature loggers in these burrows to see how exposed these chicks were to extreme weather events during 2021.
2021 proved to have its fair share of extreme weather for Newfoundland, including Hurricane Larry, which clocked wind speeds of 180 kilometers an hour. But despite this, apparently the chicks didn't do too badly.
We found that these burrows were providing amazing protection for the chicks. The burrows were around 10 degrees warmer during extreme cold events and also 10 degrees cooler during extreme warm events.
Burrows used by the puffins and storm petrels that Karen researches is a fairly common form of nesting for seabirds. But here on the West Coast, Sonia researches a species called marble murrelets that take an entirely different approach to nesting.
They're quite solitary, and they utilize old-growth forests.
They nest in the high canopies of the old-growth rainforest, choosing mossy platforms to lay their little green eggs.
Because their terrestrial environment is declining, and generally their population trends are going down, in Canada they're listed as threatened. You can't just study them in half their habitat. You also have to study them in their marine habitat. And that's basically what I do.
Sonia is painting a more complete picture of the pressures and conservation opportunities for these birds.
They're facing pressures on two sides. On the one side, the amount of old growth available is decreasing. And then on the other side, the marine habitats are becoming busier places. And on top of that, the waters are warming, which decreases the amount of food available in certain areas in certain years.
This means that marbled murrelets are faced with less choices for nesting habitat on land. But even if they do find a viable nesting site, if the marine environment nearby doesn't have enough food for them, they still won't be able to nest there anyways.
Seabirds are a great example of how our lands and oceans are uniquely connected. Because of their life cycles, they're on the front lines of the climate crisis. They're resilient, but more science and action is needed so we don't lose these remarkable birds. Thanks so much for watching. Check out our other videos and don't forget to subscribe.